My name is Derrick Broze. I'm from Houston, Texas, and since 2010 I've been involved with activism in the form of, well, a bunch of different varieties of activism, but specifically working in the community, trying to focus on community solutions by working with the group, the Activist Alliance as we call it, the Houston Freethinkers, which is a community that I helped found in 2010, first as a blog. And so the Houston Freethinkers, we do a lot of activism, whether that's feeding the homeless to hosting benefit shows for causes we believe in, or documentary screenings, or going out to the streets and spread the messages, or confronting cops, or whatever it may be. We do that stuff, and I've been doing that for 7 years now. And along the way I started just writing more and more, and I've gotten opportunities now as a journalist, so I've been focusing on journalism more and more the last 4 years or so. And now that's what I do exclusively, is just freelance journalism for a few different websites. And I also have now, I guess I'm an author now, writing 3 books, and my book series co-authored with John Vibes. And yeah, so I'm an activist, I'm an anarchist, I'm an author, all these things, but overall I think I'm just a free human trying to figure out solutions for the problems that I see in the world.
So what are you doing now? Tell us about your tour and the new book and everything.
Sure. So starting this June 2017, I just launched my first national tour. I don't really like to call it a book tour or speaking tour per se, because it's really much more than that. It's unlike anything that I think I've seen anybody else do, in the sense that we're trying to bring together elements of the message of the conscious resistance, or what I'm calling holistic anarchism now, into this movement, so to speak, where we're not just talking about anarchism. We're not just talking about agorism or various facets of these philosophies, although those debates are interesting and necessary at some times. But we're trying to reach a broader audience. And in the last few months I've realized that I'm not trying to just connect specifically anymore to anarchists. I'm trying to reach a lot more people now. And the message that I promote, which is one of individual healing and individual empowerment, it resonates with a lot of people who may not yet realize that they are anarchists, or at least they're interested, because they either don't understand the definition of anarchism, or they've been propagandized to think it's something else that it's not. So out of that desire to reach and connect with people on this, I started planning this national tour. First just thinking, hey, putting it out there on social media, who would be interested in hosting me if I came to give talks? And since then the idea has grown, and it's now called the Decentralize Your Life Tour, and it's bringing in elements of meditation, of talks on freedom cells and mutual aid groups, on using technology that exists today, apps and different decentralized peer-to-peer technology, to render government useless and the state useless, and a lot of the power institutions useless and irrelevant in our lives, as well as talking about practical steps that people can take in their communities. I'm really trying to focus on community building, and my new book, my latest book, Manifesto of the Free Humans, is essentially a recapping and an updating of the agorist philosophy of Samuel Konkin. Like, we bring it into the new age as far as the internet and apps and other technology, and taking the ideas that he wrote about in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and bringing them up to our time now, and then expanding upon them as well, and using the concept of freedom cells, of small groups working together locally to build power, to share knowledge, to share skills, to defend themselves, defend their communities. Taking these ideas and bringing them to people. I recognize that the way it's going to grow is to be on the ground with people, talking to them and helping them build these cells and helping them build these ideas. And so yeah, now I've been doing this thanks to Bitcoin.com, and we're happy to promote cryptocurrency and things that help people work outside of the state. We're now able to visit 52 cities this summer to spread this message, and we actually had 65 cities reach out to us that we're just not able to get to at this time. So there's a lot of people who are interested in this message and who want us to come share this message, and they want me to come talk about the ideas that I'm spreading through my books and through the internet and through the journalism and stuff. So that's been my big focus now and will continue to be. I kind of see the next couple years of my work, my activism, focusing on this, doing these tours in the sense of going and talking to people hand to hand. And really, when you look at the traditional anarchist movement, early anarchist movement in America, and I think probably radicals of all types around the world, when they were trying to get their message out, they would go to the town square, go to the center of the city or what have you, and just give talks right there on the street, or they would try to get themselves hosted in lecture halls and things like that. Emma Goldman and plenty of other people doing national speaking tours, and sometimes in the same way supported and funded by people who were wealthier than them but believed in their message or wanted to help support them. And so it's a tradition that I'm definitely happy to be a part of, and to recognize that the people on the ground level need to hear the message. Not everybody's going to come read the books, and I understand that, but maybe through a conversation or through a presentation I can convince them of the value of these ideas and the ways that they can apply it to them. So I anticipate I'll spend the next couple of years just doing this groundwork, laying the groundwork for an intentional community that we're going to launch in 2020, which was announced at the end of the new book. Basically taking these concepts and putting them in practice, finding some land here in Texas, and really trying to show people what agorism, what a counter-economic market can look like in real life, and what free humans coming together can look like, and a decentralized manner is possible, and not wait to, for the state to collapse or something like that, but just start living the way we want to today.
Right. So these are like pretty developed political ideas and social ideas. How did you get started in all of this?
For me, it came more on the, I guess, the conspiratorial side of things first. Like I woke up in the sense of questioning government, questioning institutions of power, and looking behind the curtain, so to speak, and went down those rabbit holes for a couple years before I really started to look at things from a philosophical manner. It was just always, I knew that there was bad people out there was bad things happening, and there was people to blame and such, but it took a couple years for me to really start studying the problems like from the institutional level and saying like, okay, maybe it's the state itself that's the problem. But definitely there was some early days for me involved Ron Paul, and like a lot of different people, I think, which is it's an interesting thing for me because I never voted for him. I never told anybody to vote for him. I wasn't a public supporter of Ron Paul, but I read his book Revolution and Manifesto, and my mind at the time was very open. It was just opening up to all these new ideas and very open to them, and so it was everything I needed to hear, really. And then from there I've just expanded much further on my research, and I take pride, I guess is a way to put it, in researching these ideas and researching philosophy in general. But I think there's a lot of people, especially in America, who maybe they came up the same American libertarian, Ron Paul trend, Rothbard type of trend, and they don't really do much studying or reading outside of that scope. And in the same context, you also have people who are, say, like Kropotkin, and they love, anarcho-communism, etc., but they've never read Rothbard. So you have these sides that seem to be diametrically opposed, but often they don't actually read each other's work or really address it's just the other side's wrong. And so I make it a goal of mine to read all these different anarchists. I consider myself to be an individualist anarchist. I'm inspired by Josiah Warren and Benjamin Tucker and Spooner and others like that, but also I like some of Kropotkin's ways of explaining anarchism in his view as well. And so I like to read them all. I study these radical movements and these histories. So that's just come over time. Just my interest in these ideas has peaked, and so I created a couple years ago. I created a mind map in my room, starting with Proudhon and William Godwin, and then also basically tracking the movement of anarchism, socialism, and communism around Russia and Ukraine, China, and I just mind mapped it all. Okay, this person led to this person, and was able to really just sit back and study each of them individually and the people that played a role in these various movements. And I enjoy that. I'm a nerd for that kind of stuff, for that type of history, and I think as somebody who's interested in anarchism as a philosophy, I'm trying to be as little dogmatic as possible, and no, I believe that agorism is the answer that appeals to me, the strategy, market anarchism, and using counter-economics. But I also think there's value in other schools and to learn from, and that's why in Manifesto of the Free Humans we we have a chapter called Can Propertarians and Non-Propertarians Coexist? And it's all about, we do a bunch of thought experiments about, okay, what if ANCOMs move next to this propertarian, and how is this going to unfold? And because I want to know these answers, I don't think we're ever going to convince everybody to be anarcho-communist, or everybody to be anarcho-capitalist, or agorist, or whatever. I mean, there's going to be diversions and divisions and things. The beautiful spontaneous order will happen. You know, people will do things differently, and I accept that. What I want is just us to come to a common mutual understanding that we should respect each person's individual right, I guess is one way to put it, to be free, to be alive, and to be free from harm and coercion, and to find ways to organize to get past the institutions we have today, but to do so without stomping each other in the process. You know, so I do think that's possible. And yeah, so I mean, for me, it's just a deep interest of mine, and also I think that these ideas are radical enough to work. I think there's a reason that they've been suppressed by the state over time, and that there's so much propaganda about anarchism, and so it's an interest that is both as a student, but also because I think these are the ideas that could change the world. I mean, it's really what it comes down to.
Yeah. And a lot of anarchists spend their time focusing on simply destroying the powers that be, and like ending the state and ending capitalism and whatever. So I was wondering if you could just go into a little more the world that you'd like to see come to fruition, and also explain to us what holistic anarchism is.
Sure. So I definitely have my individual vision, like anybody who's thought about these ideas and these questions. But I also think it's important to stress that for all the books and people out there that can give you their vision, you know, none of us really know what human beings are going to organize like when we have an absence of coercion, we have the absence of the state. But in Manifesto of the Free Humans and the idea of outlining this intentional community that we describe, I use this pyramid that really outlines the foundation, the bedrock of what I'm trying to create. And for me, it's like I express it, this is what we want our intentional community to look like. I'm not saying everybody in the world should live this way. I think if people strive towards these goals, they probably would be happier, and maybe things would be better. But again, I don't believe that I can force everybody to live my way. So I have a vision of what I think could be beneficial, and that's where that pyramid comes from. And you have the top of this pyramid is what I would say is sovereignty of the individual, which is a phrase that comes from Josiah Warren, America's first anarchist, individualist anarchist, who is just a really brilliant guy in so many different ways outside of his anarchist philosophy. But he came up with the concept of sovereignty of the individual, and after his experiences with these communal communities, with Robert Owen, who was coming from Scotland, he established these essentially early communist communities in the United States. Josiah Warren went and lived within these communities, and he watched them fail. And he said the reason that they failed is because they put the collective communal interests above that of the individual, and so it led to all these different problems. And so he became a very strident individualist, and was like, the sovereignty of the individual must be respected, like otherwise there's going to come, things are going to end up chaotic. And so he just developed that concept from there. So that really is something that I think can be a guiding force. It's also similar to what some people term the non-aggression axiom or non-aggression principle, which is not really a terminology that I use myself. I prefer sovereignty of the individual, but I think that those concepts and concepts like them should be a guiding force in this. Then you have the other corner of this pyramid, which I simply just call mindfulness, and this is everything from meditation. I promote meditation because of the obvious benefits that are, study after study have shown the benefits of meditation and health and stress relief and all sorts of varieties beyond just the spiritual element of that. This also includes nonviolent communication, using compassionate or nonviolent communication in our interactions with individuals so that we can help promote and create this better world that I believe we're after. Also, I would include in this ideas like peaceful parenting, because these are all, again, about being mindful in your actions. So it's not just about the way that you interact with the state or with the capitalist class or the powers that be, whatever these institutions are, but it's about our relationships and who we are as individuals. So I would put all that under mindfulness. And then the other corner of this pyramid would be permagora. And this is a concept, a word that was created by a permaculture farmer named Eric McCool, and he's from Portland, Oregon. And he's a permaculture farmer who is also an agorist who understands the black and gray markets, and he sees the permaculture community charging people thousands of dollars to get licenses or certificates to say that they're permaculture farmers. And he wants to kind of bring in the agorist message into this community, but also bring the permaculture message into the agorist community, into the anarchist community. Permaculture itself, it stands for permanent agriculture, and there's a set of 10 guiding principles that go along with it that are worth looking into, and anybody who's interested, I think they should look further in that. But essentially what it's about is, again, applying this idea of non-aggression or non-destructive relationships with our relationship to the planet itself. So rather than invasive and destructive agricultural processes or monocropping and pesticides and these kind of things, you are taking into account the flow of the land and which animals naturally come to that area and the insects. And instead of trying to spray chemicals all over to get rid of them, you're like, okay, well, maybe we can plant some food that those deer will eat, and then they will help feed this ecosystem. So it's thinking all about these things, about the circular ecosystem, thinking about our relationship with the planet. And I think if you're thinking long term, which I tend to do, especially when bringing in an indigenous mindset and thinking about the 7th generation, thinking about not just who is here today and your kids, but the 7 generations coming, then we have to start taking these kind of things into consideration, like how we're treating the planet and how we're living our lives. So that sort of pyramid there is what is going to be the guiding force for this intentional community, and that is roughly what I would envision an ideal world, so to speak. And that is where the term holistic anarchism comes from. This is something that we introduced in Manifesto of the Free Humans and that I'm continuing to develop. But essentially what it comes down to is, we obviously understand what anarchism means. Holistic means dealing in whole systems. So you're not just looking at the individual parts, but you're looking at the entire system. Holism is the philosophy behind it, and there's a bunch of different areas that it goes into. This could include, for example, holistic medicine. It looks at the whole body, how is it treating the body as a whole rather than just that one individual part. There's also holistic ecology, which views the environment, with humans and the environment, as one thing rather than separate pieces to study, and so that changes the context that they're studying it. So with that in mind, I recognize that if we're after creating anarchism or something, a stateless society, a classless society, whichever your goal is per se, I think that ultimately we have to recognize that we each in some ways play a role in our own enslavement and our own oppression, and it behooves us to take an honest examination of our lives and to look at each area of our lives and to study what it is we see in the world that we don't like. What are the institutions of power that we are not in support of? What are the news items that make you upset every day? You're hearing about climate change, or you're hearing about like the police state, or you're hearing about the oppression of people of color. Whatever your issue is, look at that and ask yourself, how are you contributing to that? Are you contributing to the destruction of the environment? Do you have an unhealthy lifestyle? And look at all these different areas. It's not for me to tell you what that's going to look like, but for each individual to make this assessment. And then from that, when you understand what it is that you oppose, and then you can honestly say, okay, well, I'm still working against myself here by using their currency. Why haven't I abandoned the US dollar and gone to some other alternative or created an alternative because I'm feeding the machine? Or why do I say I'm against the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmaceutical complex and all that represents, yet I'm popping pills every weekend or whatever? All these different things that we can see that we are working against ourselves. So holistic anarchism is essentially just saying that it's not just our battles in the political arena that are going to lead to this next stage. It's not just going to be fighting the fascists or fighting the capitalists or fighting the statists. It's going to be about how we as individuals live our lives. So it's both. It has to be both the battle of the physical world as well as the internal struggle that each of us are dealing with. And I think when we start focusing on that, we start seeing how can we create a world that is going to lead to anarchy. I believe we do that by creating more empowered individuals. And to do that, we have to encourage healing, we have to encourage self-reflection, we have to encourage individuals getting to know themselves, getting to know what their goals are, what their desires, what freedom looks like in their mind, and then for them to say, okay, how am I contributing to that? And then from that standpoint, we can decide how to act. and it's going to take action. People are going to have to be moved to action. So holistic anarchism is just saying it's time for us to look at the bigger picture rather than just our specific area of focus and see how we're working against ourselves.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like capitalism or domination to me. You mentioned agorism earlier. What is agorism, and how does it differ from capitalism? Maybe you can answer after that.
Sure. So agorism it's defined a few different ways, but essentially it's a radical, revolutionary, libertarian philosophy that somewhat leans left, further left than Rothbard, I'd say. But it came about in that same time by Samuel Konkin III in the 60s and the 70s, and he developed it as a method for achieving agorism or achieving freedom through using the counter-economic markets, which he termed the black and gray market. So essentially, it's asking people to abandon, to vacate, to reject the status markets, the white market that the state controls and taxes and uses their currency, and instead to exploit the gray market, unlicensed, unregulated markets, or the totally illegal in the eyes of the state markets, and then redirect that money, that time, that energy, and into our own communities and building local power and building what he called agoras, and I talk about freedom cells and mutual aid groups as a mechanism to help us create this and get to this state. And agorism, it gets its name from the Greek word for the marketplace, the open marketplace, the agora. So essentially Konkin was saying, he was a market anarchist, and he was saying if we were going to create this more free world, if we were going to be able to rid ourselves of the state, we don't need to try to vote them out. We don't need to, it's just silly to even think that violence against them would be effective, because you can go back to anarchists in the 1850s and they already recognize like they've got too many guns, like there's no way we could fight them physically now. So I don't think that's even a realistic option, even if we thought it was a moral thing to do. I don't see much value in that. Konkin offers a third way, another alternative, which is building. Rather than waiting for the state to wither away or thinking that voting's going to fix it or the violence, then you just create and you build and you grow and you outcompete them. And I've definitely seen value in this philosophy over the recent years. It's becoming more and more known, and I think it's because of the internet and technology and decentralized peer-to-peer technology is allowing the agorist counter-economic markets to flourish and to come into being. In reference to capitalism, and I think obviously when you're talking about capitalism, I can post on social media, what does capitalism mean to you, and get 100 different answers, and so I think it's problematic in any situation. It's hard to have a conversation if we're all talking from different definitions. So when you ask that word, I think I know what you're saying, but the audience may hear it and may think something different. Because there are people out there who say that capitalism just means free and open trade. Personally, I don't think that markets do equal capitalism, and even if they do so, I argue, and me and John argue in Manifesto of the Free Humans, that words like capitalism, socialism, communism have all been associated with statism and authoritarianism throughout history, and that we believe they're just basically, it's time to abandon them and to stop. I'm not interested in saving or salvaging that word. But I did write an essay called Agorism is Not Anarcho-Capitalism, because the two philosophies are closely aligned in the sense that anybody can be a counter-economist, anybody can be an agorist. I would say that ANCOMs and even syndicalists and pretty much anybody who doesn't necessarily want to reject all of money, even if you do reject all of money and you're after barter networks, you could still create counter-economic barter networks that obviously if you're bartering, you're not using the state's currency, and so you're practicing counter-economics. But what I did say in the essay is that counter-economics, I think, is the strategy. That's what Konkin was talking about, right? That's a strategy that can be employed by people across the spectrum. Anybody can use the black and gray market. But agorism, an agorist, is somebody who specifically understands and values the philosophy that Konkin put forth, which was his specific idea about, he had views on hierarchy, he had views on wage slavery and other positions. He was also for in defense of homosexuals and women back in a time, even in the 60s, when it wasn't really popular, and some of his more conservative ANCAP, colleagues were not interested in those issues and were bashing feminism and such. So I think that when you look at Samuel Konkin as a person and you look at what he put in his books, in the Agorist Primer and New Libertarian Manifesto, that is what agorism is, right? So if those words and those ideas don't jive with you, that's fine. You could still be a practicing counter-economist, but you wouldn't necessarily be an agorist. So the reason I say that is because I don't think that they're the same thing. I don't think that agorism and anarcho-capitalism are the same thing, and I don't think that agorism is just is just, you know, unbridled capitalism, or what some people say. I do think that the market itself, which is just this space where people can do business and exchange ideas and communicate, and goods and all kinds of things, is just a state of being that exists. It's there, right? And, you know, I guess you can call that capitalism if you want, but as I said, I think it has so many negative connotations into much of the world. That's not what they believe it is. So why spend so much time and energy trying to fight to save this thing? And at the end of the day, Agorism hopes to exploit the black and gray markets to take power away from the state. The goal is not, though, to, once the state is weakened and fallen down, for the counter-economic markets to then take over and become like the white market. Then at that point, you know, then Konkin says we would be reaching the point of the truly freed market. You know, we would be in the Agora. So I think at that point, then we will be able to see how free people organize. We'll see true spontaneous order, you know, and there will be communes and collectives and co-ops and entrepreneurs. There will be definitely entrepreneurs, and maybe some sort of hierarchical workplaces. There will be a mix of things, you know, and that's, to me, is the open market. But I don't think that that's what capitalism is. Capitalism has always been associated with statism and with interference in the market, you know. So that's, I know some will argue otherwise, and some will say that I'm being too soft on the capitalist, but at the end of the day, I don't see any value in many of those words, you know. Anarchism, I'll make an effort to save that. But capitalism, communism, socialism, I'm not interested in those terms.
Yeah, sure. You're also interested in indigenous struggles. Can you tell us how you got involved in that and why it's important to you?
Yeah, so I'm indigenous to this land. I'm native to this land on both sides of my family, but I didn't grow up on a reservation. I was never taught Spanish, and what's interesting is now that I've started to learn more about my indigenous ancestry, I'm kind of glad that I didn't learn Spanish, because when you really think about it, it's just the language of the colonizers that came here and attacked my family that was already existing on this land mass known as North America. You know, my family that is traditionally called Mexican, which is, it's a word that I'm becoming more and more uncomfortable with, because before it was Mexico, my family was just existing on here in what we call Texas, you know, and they're darker skinned people, sometimes known as Taino Indians, that have been here for generations, for thousands of years, you know, and it became Texas, it became Mexico, there's Spanish colonization, all these, you know, different forms of interfering with our life. And on the other side of my family, I have Seminole Indian, but as I said, I didn't grow up on a reservation. I was never taught even Spanish, the language of my colonizers, let alone, you know, an indigenous language. So I'm very much detached from that part of my life. But as I've gotten older, and the more I've explored this and got to know about it and try to find out about my family's roots, it's become even increasingly important. And then also as a journalist, I think it's important for me because there are so many indigenous struggles and resistance movements taking place in the world today. America has dozens of them, and it's happening in Australia, you know, Papua New Guinea, South America, Brazil. I mean, all over the world are indigenous people still being, you know, essentially they're facing genocide in some places, and they're being exterminated, they're being relocated. All of these same things that many people I've come to realize, and I think myself included before getting so involved in this, don't realize that it's still taking place. You know, people think that Columbus and colonization and things like that was 500 years ago, 600 years ago. They don't recognize that there's still indigenous communities, you know, suffering right now. Some of the highest rates of poverty and alcoholism and drug abuse are on reservations, and the people on reservations are often exploited, and it's just, there's immense poverty. And so it's become an interest because of my own family, because of my ancestry, but also as a journalist, I've gone to Oak Flat in Arizona to go stay with the camp out there. They're fighting a copper mine out there in Arizona, and I went 3 times to Standing Rock, both again sometimes, you know, I was dragging the wood to block the roads, and other times I'm there holding the camera to document. I do both roles because as a journalist it's important to cover. People need to know what's going on, but also I'm there, I cover the things I support and that I care about, you know. I don't believe in the kind of objectivism that the mainstream tries to sell. You know, if you care about something, if you're there for a cause, like I can hold a camera and I can report it, but I can just as easily stand in front, you know, and protect people. And the other thing is, when it comes to indigenous struggles and native resistance, I do believe that the indigenous people must play a role in any sort of larger movement towards a stateless society, classless society, what have you, that our history has been so wrought with violence and with theft, and there's so many people that are hurting in Native communities and lashing out at our own people and infighting, and all the kind of things you see in other movements that continue to exist. But when you really think about it, the Native movement, what we've been seeing recently with Standing Rock in the last year, which I think was really the resurgence of a larger Indigenous movement, not just about pipelines and such, but just, this was the largest gathering of Indigenous people all around the world probably ever to take place, from Norway to Australia to 500 plus tribes in the US, so just a very beautiful sight. And that is kind of like the second coming of what was known in the 60s as the Red Power movement. A lot of people know about the Black Power movement, but less people know about the Red Power movement, when you had people like Russell Means and John Trudell and Dennis Banks and these other really well-known, teenager and 20-something radical Native activists who they're the last people to have a gunfight with the firefight with the U.S. government at Wounded Knee. Then they led these massive marches calling attention to the violence perpetuated against their people and the poverty. They took Alcatraz Island for 19 months, had a standoff with the U.S. government. A lot of people don't know about that history until the FBI came and basically starved them out, and so they were leading an act of resistance. And the reason that happened is because it wasn't until the 60s when Native communities were allowed to sing our songs for the first time, to say the prayers, and to grow their hair long. It was the first time in, since colonization, basically, that they were given the right back to grow their hair and to have prayers and things that now are like, so think about it, it's less than 100 years that people have been able to recapture our traditions and stuff, much of which have been lost to the pages of history because of the consequences of war and violence. So people are picking up the pieces that they can, and I've learned from the Choctaw, I've learned from the Seminole, I've learned from other groups, many groups that I got the pleasure of meeting at Standing Rock and at Oak Flat, and other struggles that I've gone to visit. But I also, as I said, I'm really disconnected from that, and it's something that it motivates me to learn more about my past and where I come from, because one way or another, we're all Indigenous. This is the thing that the Parasite class has done a great job of getting people to forget, that no matter what color they are, which continent they came from, or where their people originally were from, that we all were tribal peoples at one point or another. It just doesn't mean that everybody should, abandon civilization and needs to go back to that. But I think if we can look back to that and where our ancestors come from, and through that, their connection to the earth and the valuable lessons that come with that, I think we start to see why this system would want us detached from our ancestry, and want us to believe that, you're white instead of like you're Irish, or you're something deeper than that, that has a tradition, that has a history, and that has customs and has rituals and has practices that maybe still can have meaning to us as people. So we're all Indigenous in one way or another. I think that's important to remember, and it's important for people around the world to connect to their Indigenous ancestry, and then to recognize that any real movement of resistance is going to have to recognize like the crimes that have been done to Indigenous people, and to, if not let them lead, definitely they need a valuable role in the movement, so to speak.
What role has spirituality played in shaping your political views?
So I was spiritually curious before I ever got into activism or politics, and I really do think that plays an immense role. I hear some people argue for this idea of compartmentalization. They say like, if we're an anarchist or we're a libertarian, that only applies to this. This is what the ethic is about. It's about this, and only this. Anything outside of that scope, your veganism or your spirituality or whatever, it's who you are as a person, but it's irrelevant to this philosophy. And I argue completely against that, that to say that who we are as people is just as important as our political beliefs. And in fact, obviously we come to our political beliefs because of who we are as individuals. So for me, my journey began as a spiritual one before it ever got to politics. I'd had experiences with psychedelics throughout my teenage years and my early 20s, and those are the first things I can credit towards giving me a sense that maybe there was something deeper than the 5 sense world that was out there, or that there was something that bigger than myself. This first sort of ego check that, hey, you're not the final end all be all of everything, kind of feeling. So that's, I had those sort of thoughts that, all right, open-minded. Then when I got locked up and I went to prison, I started reading and to meditation. I started meditating while I was locked up, and I also just continued to do research on states of mind, different states of mind, particularly mindfulness, developing a sense of mindfulness. And in prison, it was very helpful to meditate and to be able to bring myself to center. And I learned a lot about Buddhism, specifically Zen Buddhism. I started to get interested in shamanism and things like this. So those were all interests that I had before I ever even would have called myself an anarchist. I've always been anti-authoritarian, but I hadn't really put those pieces together, as I was saying earlier. I hadn't really got that philosophical backing. But I'd already come to the conclusion that I didn't want to aggress upon another person, and that whatever kind of life I wanted to live, it wanted to be one of creating a better world, which I think is what anarchists are all ultimately after, is creating a better world. And so I was influenced by concepts like the Bodhisattva, which comes from Buddhism, and it's the idea of somebody, a student and a teacher who is seeking enlightenment in a way, and they choose to put off their own enlightenment, their own salvation, until all other sentient beings have achieved theirs. And so just this idea of service and coming together, and also various Buddhist ideas of not mistreating animals and things like that. Those all played a role in my belief systems before I ever got into reading anarchist philosophy. But as I've read anarchist philosophy and I've developed the ideas of my spirituality haven't become less relevant. It just became this thing that came together, and that's where my work started to become the conscious resistance and ultimately holistic anarchism. So my work is definitely very much influenced by my spirituality, and I've come to see that there are other anarchists who feel this way as well. I know there are a lot of atheist anarchists out there, and that's fine as well. But since I've started speaking about this in 2013, I've come across hundreds of people who would consider themselves anarchists, but also have some sort of deeper sense of deeper way of looking at the world.
Where can anyone go to find out more about your work?
So the best place to find my work, my essays, my books, the tour dates, all that stuff is theconsciousresistance.com. I also have a journalism social media profile. It's just my name, Derrick Broze. .contently.com, and I post all my articles and interviews and videos and stuff there. So those are the two places that I post that, and I'm always interested in connecting with new people and having these conversations.